Okay, so welcome everybody. This is SIG API Machinery bi-weekly meeting for Kubernetes open source. Today is May 1st, 2024. In some parts of the world, it's Labor Day, so we have a smaller audience today, but we have a nice set of topics. So just want to get this started. Let's get into the first one, and I will give it to Sriram.
Yeah, thanks. Hey everyone, I'll just quickly introduce myself. My name is Sriram. I've been mostly active in SIG release, but I've also made like a couple of small PRs from SIG CLI. And yeah, basically I met and I was talking with alexzielenski at KubeCon, and he was talking about this particular issue that I can work on for adding cell support for additional printer columns in the CRD definition. And yeah, so this is my like first time working on an actual cap. So I like wanted to get some guidance and like this particular item was added in the call like last week, but in the last meeting. But after that, we had talked to Stefan, who had agreed to review the PR, and I believe like Joe Wetz also had like given some reviews on the doc. So yeah, and yeah, I also wanted to ask y'all if there are some like previous PRs or KEPs related to this particular area of the code, which I can go through and like learn more.
There is. So the KEP for CRD field selectors using cell is very, very closely related to this. It's an adjacent field to additional printer columns. It accesses. It doesn't use, well, no, wait, that one doesn't use cell, but it does give you field columns. So I could, what would be a good one to show the use of cell specifically? Let me think about that. I could probably find you something that has cell, but that should give you some context.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, so the PR is still a work in progress for adding the KEP. I'll continue working on that, and yeah, I'm excited to be get my.
No problem. I think you have here, like most of the people that you mentioned. There is Joe, there is Cici, there is Alex, and then I think Stefan is not here today because of Labor Day. But yeah, you know, any guidance that you might need, you probably are going to find it through this team.
Yeah, thanks for working on this. The only thing I was really thinking about when I first saw this idea was what should the cell cost be for these? It's going to be pretty mechanically easy to add the code to do what we should do. And then the main question is when we added, if you look at like CRD validation rules using cell, one of the main features to that is there's a static cost that we compute as an estimate, and then when we run the actual evaluation, we do a runtime cost. So there's actually two cost systems. So picking the limits for those, it's going to be easy mechanically to set the limits, but then selecting what those limits should be for this kind of use case is going to be different than what we've done before, because here you're going to be running cell again and again for items in a list, which is not something we have experience doing.
I had a question about, I know there was discussion in the field selector proposal around like supporting cell now versus in the future, and the way field selection is implemented, like whether you're using the extracted values or not, we pay the cost of evaluating the cell. To my knowledge, this proposal would be the first time we're using cell in a read path where it has to execute on every object.
That's right.
So it seems like similar cost considerations would apply here, like comparing what the costs are for JSONPath expression evaluation versus cell expression evaluation. So yeah, the cost is concerning to me, like switching to use it per object, possibly multiple times per object in a list where you could have like hundreds or thousands of objects being returned. So that I just didn't know how much of the discussion in the field selector stuff applied to this, and maybe we also weren't ready to do it yet for the same reasons.
Yeah, I think that is the concern. Like, how do we have a principled reasoning about what the limit should be? Like, how much costs should you incur here? The difference, I think, between field selection and this is that since field selection can be used to select whether or not you're going to show something, if you're showing like the first page of something, you might have to consider there's like a million entries. You might have to consider all of them by the time to find the few that match your selection rules. So you can be applying it to ones that you don't actually get back. Here, you're only going to be applying it to the things that you send back, but that could still be large and could still be expensive. So we need to have, I think, some principled way to think about what that cost should be and some benchmarks to back up that like we're not really introducing an inordinate amount of latency in the worst case. So maybe there's only so many printer columns you can have with it, or there's a certain total cost per response that we can tolerate. We need to figure that out.
Yeah, it would be good to know the cost differences. Like, I think one field would be very cheap, but when you consider you could have multiple fields and hundreds or thousands of objects, like just knowing the delta between the JSONPath evaluation and the cell evaluation, I think could get really significant. But yeah,
I agree. One other thing I thought about with field selection that might apply here is I've been mostly thinking about it in the list use case, but the watch use case is also really interesting. I don't know if there's any special consideration there, but for field selection, one of my main concerns is like you have different watchers with different field selectors. Now you've got a system that's like every time it's got to send watch responses back, it has to look at every single client and figure out which field selector or cell it has to apply for those cases. And so we didn't want to just throw that in without really thinking through, like, can this ever be made efficient? What are we really signing ourselves up for?
So is this an action item for Sreeram to, try to run a comparison between those as part of getting this approved, or?
It might be good to, separate from this meeting, have a deeper dive where we think about how what principles we could use to establish limits and figure out like which benchmarks we could use to help us prove that we're doing something reasonable and fine, because we don't have any basis for those limits for this yet. I have an intuition that you could probably find some limits that are low enough that it would be safe, but finding ones that are low enough, safe, and high enough that they're useful is going to be maybe a little more tricky.
Okay, Sreeram.
Yeah, I guess then I can like go through this and then we can like take the conversation offline in a group DM where I can add Joe, Alex, and Jordan maybe. And then we can schedule this call separately. What do you folks think?
Yeah, I'm happy to drop in, and I think Alex would be really interested too. And then we could see if we can come up with a proposal.
Jordan is like,
Okay.
why did I speak? I get another thing to do. Okay, very good. So you know what to do next, right? Sreeram, looks like you're not blocked. You can continue working.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Very good. Let's move to the next one. Ben or Cici?
Yeah. Ben, do you want to talk about it, or I can also talk about it?
Oh, you can go ahead.
Sure. So thanks, Ben. A bug was recently discovered that the cost evaluation wording for the validation admission policy has some issues, which is missing for the extended library we added. I think the biggest concern comes from the authorizer check cost, which we specifically made it very costly, set the cost number previously. So we only allow like no more than 2 authorization check per expression. And now since we didn't wire in the cost estimator, so that check is missing. So that leads to a security concern where like the admins can have very large number of authorization checks writing in their policy, or even like per expression. So thanks for all the people who jumped in and looked at this issue. I guess we previously, like if you jump into the last comment, I think Jordan has a really great suggestion on how to relating, because the biggest concern for fixing this would be like it's definitely a breaking change. And since 1.30 is already released and this feature is graduated to GA, so there might already be expressions persistent in etcd, which has a very costly, which is a very costly expression. So we don't want to fix it like with breaking the existing behavior. So
Just to make sure we're all on the same page on what exactly the problem is.
Yeah.
Is the problem specific to the cell library extensions that we've added in Kubernetes and and that the cost that we've written in Kubernetes for those libraries isn't working?
yes, it's only applied to the libraries we added, the extended libraries we added in Kubernetes.
Yeah, so we have verified that otherwise all the limits are working, the built-in libraries from.
Yes.
Okay. Great.
Question about that. Does this impact the cell CRD validation? Do we have any extensions there, or was that just always
No.
safe for another reason?
We don't, I believe it doesn't apply for the CRD validation rules, since we specifically said the unwired in the cost estimation in the CRD validation rule path. It's just when we like building the environment for validation admission policy, like this was missed while setting up the environment.
Do we know, this is sort of an aside, but we're using cell in more places. Match conditions.
Yes. Unfortunately, like if like, for example, match conditions, if they wire in the environment configuration from the same place, then the problem will apply.
Okay,
Otherwise,
let's take a follow-up to sweep the places we're currently using cell and check for cost wiring.
sure.
And if there's any guidance for new areas using cell, like see if we can reduce the possibility we get this happening in the future. I don't want to distract from like figuring out this particular issue, but sweeping what we have and making sure we don't make the problem worse or repeat this gap in the future would be great.
Sure, that makes sense. I'll create a separate issue to track and list all the places we use cell and yeah, listed the suggestions.
Since we're looking at my comment, I'm happy to talk through it if we want.
Oh, sure, that would be great. Thank you.
So the current state of the world is we have people maybe already wrote validating admission policies and created them while in beta or in brand new 130 GA clusters, like in the last 2 weeks, which are currently like exceeding the cost that we would allow if we correctly like attributed cost to our extension functions, but are still like squeaking in under like the global runtime cost. Like they're not exceeding 5-second runs. I don't know. I don't remember what the overall runtime cost was. So they're more expensive than we would allow it, in like a CRD, but they're still like successful. And we don't want to break those people on a patch upgrade or even a minor upgrade. We don't want to disrupt those, but we do want to protect the API server the same way we protect it from overly expensive CRD validations for new stuff going forward. So Joe had a comment, I think the one above mine, asking if there was a way to do this on a per object basis. And I think that makes sense. If we do it with a new API field, then there's no way we can like do anything in older patch releases in a reasonable way. If we modeled it with a condition that exists in the schema in previous releases, so we could, like, there wouldn't be API level changes, it would be like code level changes to honor a condition or set a condition. So that's kind of what I sketched out. Like, if we say that strict cost enforcement is modeled as a condition, and new objects get that condition set going forward, and old objects without that condition get treated as not being strict, then we can ratchet per object. Yeah, like how we default those things, like whether we default them true in 130 patch releases or false, like that is open for discussion. We have some options there, but as a rough approach, what do people think of that?
One thing I don't quite understand. I'm issuing this via a create. So I'm doing a create. And the condition is on status.
Yep.
Are we saying that a spec create or a spec update will cause a change to a status field?
Only the create would populate the status field. We do that rarely in other places. I think in custom resources. Yeah, in custom resources, when you create a CRD, we force the current storage version of the CRD into status stored versions. Like there's a few places where we set a status field server side as part of the create. It's not common.
What does that do to server side apply?
That's a good question, but I think things under status get explicitly ignored by server-side apply in the strategy. If you look at the strategy, there's like a get reset fields.
Well, what about when the sub-resource of status is specified?
So in a status update, I'm not sure anything is using server-side apply, first of all, for status updates of validating admission policies. But what happens in that case is a good thing to check. Like the spot I'm proposing we hook this in is after server-side apply has done whatever it's going to do to the object. It's like a very procedural, mechanical, here's the object that would be persisted. We're going to populate the status object, or we're going to preserve the condition from the old status. So server-side apply is not going to affect the content of the status and the content of the condition. It might get confused about who owns the particular condition when we are doing a status update. So we would need to see what happens and reason through that. but as far as I know, there are no end user updaters of validating admission policy status that we expect. We should look at what happens if someone used server-side apply to update status and triggered the population of this condition.
I bring it up because I experienced a weird server-side apply edge case last week.
Okay.
Exploded my head. But I agree, it's going to be uncommon for someone to modify these conditions.
Those are good questions. We should check the behavior of creating with server-side apply and updating status with server-side apply and see what happens.
Alex has a hand, and I don't know if it is to answer this or to speak about something else.
I'm not sure how this would interact with server-side apply, but I was just wondering, since we're considering attaching a new state to the object on create, and normally when we ratchet validation changes, it involves like a comparison of the old object under the old scheme versus the new object. So I was wondering if that was possible in this case. Would we be able to just look at the old object and see if it, if its cost, if it used the authorizer check and its cost was less than the limit, but under the new,
Yeah,
it was over the limit, we do it that way.
we don't have static cost estimation for validating admission policy because the objects, we don't know the schema of the objects that will be presented to it.
Gotcha, that makes sense.
If we did have that, this would be easier. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was actually in the comment history that was first brought up, and we were all kind of a little bummed when we realized that we couldn't go that way. So this is a little more, it's a broader attack to the problem, but
Another
Okay.
right, yeah, another thought I had when I read Jordan's suggestion was that it applies a condition to like this specific problem, and I was wondering if we might have more problems like this in the future, and would it make sense to like version like the cell environment somehow in the condition instead?
We do already version the cell environment. Joe and I were talking about this actually. Like if we sort of fork the cell environments based on this condition and have one that applies cost here and one that doesn't apply cost based on the condition, I think we have to carry both of those forever-ish. So doing it once is a pain, but maybe workable if another thing comes up in the future. Like, are we going to get 4 environments and 8 environments? Are we going to explode the number of cell environment possibilities? Maybe. Because it's not a strict version thing. It's not like before 131 we do this and after 131 we do that. If we have the possibility of needing to keep compatibility with older objects that we're working in 130 and we want to keep working on a 131 upgrade.
yeah, this feels to me like something that should be very, very rare, and that we're having to do something that's very backwards incompatible. Usually we shouldn't have to care which environment you started with, because we retain backwards compatibility and all newer versions should work.
Like we have a versioning scheme for cell stuff where changes we intend to introduce, like new extension functions or new cell features, like we have a way to roll those out, like enable them progressively. And there we aren't sort of forking our cell environments. It's here's the previous one, here's the current one, and we just have this rolling version stream. So we already have that in place. I was trying to think of a way that we could eventually like converge this. Like if we had visibility to all the validating admission policies out there and could see that all of their statuses were strict cost enforcement or whatever, then it would be safe to remove, but that's a per deployment decision. So as a project, it's going to be really hard to get visibility to that. I guess we could ask like all the big providers that we know, where are you at? Are you seeing this? Do you still need this? Maybe down the road we could drop it, but I think it's going to be really hard.
I think it's forever, Jordan.
Yeah, me too. That makes me sad.
Yeah, that's one thing that I was going to bring up about this that we were kind of bummed about. I was talking to Jordan. It's like once we add this, we're going to kind of be stuck with it. It does show a pattern for a new way of doing ratcheting, which is cool, but it's a pretty high cost thing.
So AI is checking the interactions with apply on create and status update. Are there any other like specific holes that people see that we should like prove out and test?
We should have an E2E test that makes sure that our library cost is active.
Sure, we actually have like a unit test in place, but we didn't add enough test cases there, which should have caught this before.
Okay.
And of course,
I could accept a unit test then.
Yeah, it's like if we know we need to do it enough to write a test for it, then we will have done it. And if we didn't, then we won't have a test for it. This is what I'm worried about, like the sort of the long tail of places that are starting to use cell, that we're going to make the same mistake in those places.
yeah, we do have like a test case to checking all the cost for all the library, but unfortunately the wiring, like they build the like cell environment differently, so it's
So an E2E test
different paths from what we were using in the real.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually integration tested. The integration testing for this does work really well, but we were missing the tests there too. So yeah, obviously for this one, I think we do want to go through and cover the tests for the things that we missed really well. But I do agree, I think with Jordan's earlier point that it shouldn't be so easy to miswire things that we always want to have. So I think it's worth looking at that and trying to show to ourselves that like when you use cell in a new place, the default does everything right. And whatever caused this to be so easy to miss needs to be looked at and see if we can fix that.
Yeah, we can brainstorm that. Even if it's like the way you get access to the extended stuff, like returns you the functions and the cost stuff, so that if you're not doing something with both of those, like you've got a signature that's saying like, here's the functions, here's the cost, or you pass in the environment and by default it registers the functions and the cost. Like, or there's probably multiple ways we could slice it, but doing sensible things by default would be awesome.
Yep.
Okay. Can we talk about what we want to do if we prove this out, have tests showing that this works and doesn't mess up apply on create or apply on status update? What do we want to try to do for 131, and what do we want to try to do for 130 patch releases?
I'm supportive of keeping the window where this is possible as small as we can. So if we could get like a 130 patch that fixes this with the ratcheting, that's something I like. I don't know if that's compatible with our backport policy, but that seems to be what would be in the best interest of users and the project.
I agree.
Because it's a DOS risk, like pretty easily provable to be a DOS risk, I think we should at least make it possible to close the gap in 130. I could see a case for which way we want to default in a 130 patch release, but I think we should at least make it possible to close the gap in 130.
It is worth noting that it's a DOS risk from someone who has access to control what rights are valid in your API. So there is a risk, but it's more likely to be negligence than attack, I would think, from the people who have the power. Like, oh no, I have a DOS risk on writing this object, or they just set it to always return false. I guess one affects slightly broader surface area because it can affect reads if you actually bring the API server down, but the person who's doing this already has pretty extreme power.
Could it make it cheap to scrape the effective permissions for a lot of things really quickly? Like
the people who have
if
this,
the authorizer check you're making is parameterized based on the object, all you need is to be able to make that request to basically test the rights that everyone has.
Someone who has the ability to create a validating admission policy almost certainly has a subject access review right. So they could do that a lot more easily.
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, maybe we can move forward getting something crafted against master with the test coverage, and maybe make the decision about which way to default it in a backport, whether it's opt-in or opt-out from an admin perspective.
That sounds right.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Jordan, for taking the next to those. Let's move to Mike.
Okay, this is something that's got a little bit of attention recently. It's just about the version skew policy. I got onto it because someone made, I think, a broader misinterpretation. The policy doesn't actually explicitly state principles. It just lists some particular relationships. And there's one that's missing, which is aggregated API servers. So the narrow fix would be to update this thing to explicitly talk about aggregated API servers. And there's potentially a broader fix to state some kind of a policy from which a reader might interpret answers for other things that are not mentioned. I think that for Kube API servers, sorry, aggregated API servers, the answer is simple. All the Kube API servers have to be upgraded first. Like the other things mentioned, apart from kubectl, the aggregated API servers cannot be newer than the Kube API server. And David has his hand up.
Two thoughts. One is how would we enforce such a policy on aggregated API servers? And the second, I guess, is why couldn't an aggregated API server be newer? Actually, why shouldn't it be newer?
Okay, on enforcement, that's not something that we currently try to do. This document only aims to give guidance on how administrators should behave. And I was not proposing that we change that. And why? That is actually exhibited in I opened an issue for this, which cited an issue that someone else opened that arose because he installed a aggregated API server that was built with a newer version of the API priority and fairness. It was trying to use the V1 of the objects, which didn't exist in this Kube API server.
So we do use this document to enforce standards for PRs merging into Kube. So the document is used and you say, oh, you can't do that because we have this version skew policy. It doesn't come up so often with the Kube API server, but often does come up with, say, the kubelet. I
see. Okay, right. So you meant enforcement in terms of our expecting PRs to adhere to it, not a mechanical enforcement on administrator behavior. Okay, got it.
Correct. And that has carryover consequences, right? We write it down, but if people who are using aggregated API servers don't follow that, then why is that unreasonable, right? Like maybe they have a better notion. Now, saying you should write your aggregated API server to be compatible with n number of Kube API servers seems like the better solution.
Well, the issue here is it's asymmetric, right? Newer versions is different from older, and the aggregated API servers, in particular, as in their capacity as clients of the Kube API servers, behave like everything else. They're it's asymmetric, right? They tolerate newer Kube API servers. They don't necessarily tolerate older ones. I think the idea here is admins look at this for guidance, right? So I think we should be giving guidance about this to admins, even if it has no consequence in terms of enforcing or relevance to PR reviewing. This document also serves admins, and I think it's a relevant question for admins.
Yeah, the piece, like aggregated API servers typically have custom logic and code that's controlled by the author of that server, but then they also generally, almost always, build on the generic API server library. And so it's the generic API server library piece that I think we can speak to and we have some control over. And so that is the piece that switched to using the V1 flow control API in 129, which meant that any aggregated API server which built on it wouldn't work against a pre-129 Kube API server.
Right.
I can
That's
see
right.
making that library that we do own compatible as something valid to write up. That makes a lot of sense. But
I think, David, you're going in the surprising direction. You know, in everything else that is written in this document, which is actually, I'm getting two surprises here. Right, this document is not for it doesn't speak explicitly in terms of constraints on libraries. It
Right.
speaks in terms of behavior of admins. So I think that first and foremost, you know, it would be consistent to continue to speak in terms of behavior of admins. Now, it is true that this document,
in terms of behavior of like binary components, like here's the order that you upgrade binary components. Bringing in a library that is used by a generic API server that might have its own logic, like we can't speak to all the random logic they put into their binary. We can speak to our API server library, but mixing in a
we
library
can.
is a
Well,
little bit.
so I think part of what's going on here, right, is the other thing I mentioned is this doesn't give anybody guidance about things that are not in tree. And I think your point is that for an aggregated API server, it's a combination of out of tree code and in tree code. Okay. So I think part of what's going on here is what's missing is a statement of principles, so that someone can extrapolate beyond what we explicitly say about in tree components. And I think my understanding of what this document is saying is that the principle is that when you've got a server that is storing objects and you've got clients that are accessing that server to manipulate those objects, you need to upgrade the servers before you upgrade the clients. And I think that's a principle that can explain the particular relationships written in this document and be extrapolated to cover code that's not written in this document.
as a practical matter, if I were someone that owned a lot of aggregated API servers, I would be trying to have the broadest compatibility I possibly could across them, so that I maintained as few of those aggregated API servers as I could. Now, what that would mean is that when I did this, I would be almost always having either a vastly older or a vastly newer aggregated API server than the Kube API server that I'm running. The controllers, the client code in there, yes, I agree, has to be able to handle those different servers. But I would be trying to have as few versions of the aggregated API server as possible. So even an assumption like the aggregated API server should be newer or the aggregated API server should be older would be wrong in like half the fleet.
I'm kind of surprised still. I don't see why this is different for why if I own a lot of aggregated API servers is different from if I own a lot of controllers. We already have an answer for if you, well, I guess in some sense you don't, because, well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by own and lot, whether you're talking about code or instances. Maybe start with clarifying that.
Both. I guess if I don't have very many instances, I don't care. So yes, I would also try to do this with controllers, and they would also be either much older or much newer than the Q API server they were running. They would almost never be created about the same time. Because a goal would be like, I'm going to write the controller, I'm going to be finished, and now I'm going to run this controller from now to the end of time, because Cube has promised not to get rid of V1 APIs. And then on the other side of it, like, hey, I have this new thing, it's using an old API, but I have a new concept for it. I'm going to be putting that as far back as I possibly can.
Yeah, the not V1 API edge was the edge in question here. Like the 128 generic API server library didn't know about flow control V1 because it didn't exist yet.
For us writing the library, I think it's very reasonable for us to say we should make this library compatible +-1. I guess -1 is the direction we do it.
Yeah, you can't.
Can't make it plus. Yes. But doing that for that library, I think makes sense. But like, I don't want to make a statement that I know I'm not going to fulfill, right? So if it's like your aggregated API server should always be this level or older, well, I wouldn't recommend people do that. And if we recommend it was always this level or newer, I wouldn't recommend people do that either. I would.
I'm having trouble understanding what you would recommend. You can clearly not choose the one.
Choose one version. Like, so I would try to choose one version. If that version is newer, it's like if you do imagine cycling with Cube and you have a level, I would always be trying to run the latest controller that I have on every cluster that I own. Basically, I never want to touch it, and then when I want to touch it, I want to touch it and deploy it everywhere. And so that means that I'm going to be running really, really old. Oh, I have to touch this release. Update everything to be new. And now I'm running new for the next 2 years, and then I have to touch it again.
So let me try and disentangle a couple of issues. One is administering deployment objects, and one is building and publishing code. They're different. And in particular, even for in-tree code, out-of-tree administrators are administrating deployment objects. So if your concern is the concern of administrators administrating deployment objects, for example, that applies to stuff that's purely in-tree as well as purely out-of-tree and mixed, like an aggregated API server. So if your argument is about what we say to administrators of deployment objects, you're already arguing for a big change in the existing document.
Some of it is like depends on what you use. Like we have a conformance test that makes sure our 117 era, I think, image, aggregated server image, like still can be successfully like pulled in and run as an aggregated API server. So if you're only using stable stuff, then you can be way older than the API server and still work. And if you stop working, then we'll fix that because that's a bug because we broke something stable. If you're using unstable stuff, then there's less guarantees around that. And if you are like expecting new stuff running against old servers, you're going to be disappointed. And so like from a library perspective, the generic API server library, like not using unstable stuff by default, that is how it works by default now. Flow control was sort of the last on by default unstable thing. So I think we're moving in a better direction there. Like someone using generic API server library won't pick up unstable behaviors by default now. Expecting to use new APIs against an old server, like I guess if the 129 or 130 version of the generic library is like this feature's on now. Validating admission policy is on in 130. Enable it by default, use it by default, expect the V1 APIs to be there and listable and watchable. Like, I don't think we make that conditional on startup and say, like, check if the API is there. And if it's not, then I guess don't run this admission plugin. Maybe that's a thing we could do. That would maybe get David the behavior he wants, where he can update everyone to 130 libraries and they just don't run validating admission if that API isn't available. Feels a little fragile to do that. You could also do that with options. So you could build the binary, but then choose to disable that admission plugin when you're running against older servers. So like not using unstable stuff by default, I think we're in better shape.
Well, Sloan, wait, can you clarify what you mean by unstable? Because in the particular case that triggered this, it was a transition from beta to GA.
Right. So beta, things that depend on beta APIs do not default on anymore. Flow control was the last,
thank you.
The last legacy one out the door.
All right, thank you.
So we won't have that case anymore unless you are explicitly opting into the beta stuff. The 130, sorry, I forget the version. So 129 was when it went V1. So it went V1, I guess it's on by default. You would still have the case where 129 linked library would be like, flow control is V1, it's on by default, expect it, fail.
Exactly. So, right. So the problem is there regardless of
so
what.
There's two ways we can solve that. One is to say, don't run stuff linked against the 129 library against an older server, because it won't be there. Just don't do that. The other way is to say, you can link against 129, but you can't turn on this admission plugin that depends on a V1 API. That's a really rough ramp for someone who was using the beta and wants to go up to the GA version. But the only way to solve that is to make our library be able to watch the beta or the GA API. We may already have this issue with the compatibility version stuff we're talking about. I think we may actually. Like preserving the ability of the library to be fed by the beta or the V1 API. So now that I say that, we may already be heading down this road.
Well, again, I want to go back. I want to go back still to this question of the desiderata, what we're trying to accomplish. Okay. And again, I think for me at least, I think I need to think clearly and specifically about whether we're talking to admins or to code developers. And if we're talking to admins, the question applies to the in-tree code as well as the out-of-tree code and the mixed code. All right. And if we're saying, on behalf of admins who run any kind of code, they should be able to run, very old API servers with very new clients. Okay, that's to me, to my understanding, that's a new requirement that our existing version SKU policy does not fulfill.
As soon as we talk about library versions, we're talking to code developers and not admins.
My concern, right, for instance, is so let's say you have an HTTP 2 reset problem and you're deciding, how do I bump to fix this? And you say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to bump the one version I have that I haven't updated in 3 years to be based on 130. And I will set whatever options are required in my deployments to be able to run that back for 8 different levels of cube. And I will do that so that I can address the CVE in my extension, run the same version that I've been running for the last however many years, 5 years, and keep the behavior that I have. I don't want any of the new bells and whistles that I don't need. I can turn them off with selective options. This particular one was not disableable, which was a real pain.
What do you mean this particular one?
Flow control you couldn't turn it off via options. It kept trying to start this. Yeah.
Wait, what?
It got fixed, I think. You couldn't turn flow control off.
You couldn't turn off the controller. That was the built-in controller that you couldn't turn off.
But how do you think he got here, Jordan? So what I don't want to have happen is I don't want to end up in a situation where we choose to address a CVE in that manner, and we don't go back and create an older version for people to run because our extension doesn't have an older version. And I don't want a customer to come to me with, say, hey, look at this document. It says I should only be running this one. I can't run the one you're giving me. And
turning off new functionality is possible. Like if there's new things in the new library that just don't work against an old server, yeah, you could probably turn it off. If you can't turn it off, there should probably be a way to turn it off. It's the evolved capabilities, like a capability you already had and were already using that has changed in the newer library. So turning it off isn't really an option for you because you lose functionality you already had.
If we contain that to libraries we own and then fix it there, I would be in favor of that. But you're saying a document for admins, right? And so, Mike, if we document for admins, oh, you should never run something skewed more than one version. Well, first, that then raises the question of which version is it tied to, and things that aren't tied to these versions become difficult. And then the actual handling for cases like this, a cluster admin will look and say, oh, this doesn't match the recommended best practice. And yet, like, we were the author of the recommended best practice, and this is a good idea to do. So, like, that's writing rules for the library makes sense to me. Going through and giving a recommendation that doesn't take into account the actual state of the world doesn't make sense to me.
I just don't think our libraries support skew in either direction right now, and I don't know what it takes to.
What? No, our libraries do support. So first off, I think we do have to speak in a directed fashion. Up and first is different from down. Higher is different from lower. And we have a document that says explicitly contemplates skew where the API server is newer than everything else in the cluster.
Yeah, I think I spoke unclearly. Our libraries do not support skew in both directions today. And so until they do, and I'm not sure what it will take to get them to that point, I think we should recommend something that actually works with reality.
I tend to think so too. I have to admit, David, I'm not entirely sure I follow your example exactly. You were talking about fixing a CVE. I wasn't entirely clear on who is fixing a CVE and what.
So an aggregated API server needs a new level of a Kubernetes fix to ameliorate the HTTP2 reset problem. That fix exists in 129, doesn't exist back in whatever 4 releases back from it was, because we stopped backporting at a certain level, right? And so you can look and say, what should my aggregated API server do? And one option is to start, cherry picking into individual branches, run a fork of the dependency. The other option is to say, you know what, it's actually better for my aggregated API server to just update to the latest level of Q and run this one on every older cluster because they are compatible. And once you disable the flow control controller, they are compatible. And so that moves you from a model of I need to maintain a dozen branches to I need to maintain one branch.
I think I need to be a little more explicit and about who we're talking about. I think I think you're talking about multiple parties. You're talking about the Kubernetes project, backporting fixes that involve a HTTP2.
Also David Eads.
It's not just you, right?
The doc that we're okay. Can we start by like at least mentioning the issue in the existing doc that doesn't speak to this at all? Like I'm fine with talking about making changes to the way we do our libraries and figuring out if there's ways to improve or expand the SKU they support. But right now, they don't support SKU 1 version back. So until they do, it seems useful to document that somewhere. Maybe it's not this SKU policy. Maybe the current one is focused on the binaries we deliver, and we need another one that talks about the libraries we deliver. That's fine, but we should at least describe.
Yes, but we should
behavior.
start by documenting the current reality. I agree, and we can talk about how to get to a better reality. My reading of the current document is it is instructions for admins. It is telling administrators what to do. And we've been drawing implications for, what we as developers of Kubernetes do, and presumably other developers of out-of-tree stuff draw implications as well. But the document is written as instructions for administrators.
Yeah. I don't think this document is the right place to talk about libraries, because libraries are hidden inside other binaries. We could reference it. I think documenting in the libraries or on a separate page for libraries is more appropriate.
I'm
like talking.
happy with documentation for libraries.
Yeah, I just Ben mentioned this in the chat. Someone opened a pull request updating this doc in response to this issue. I tagged in folks from the SIG, and we can maybe gather there in giving feedback on what the current state is that should be documented and where and how. David, I agree that the more flexible we are, the easier it makes admin rollouts. It's not clear to me what the cost of making these libraries be more flexible is. And we certainly don't do it today, so we can't just recommend either direction today. It doesn't work.
Yeah, I don't mind not having a change to the library. I'd be in favor of a change to the library that made it easier to handle more SKU.
Yeah.
What I don't want to see is a version SKU policy focused for admins that makes an admin think they need to have a matched version released 130 version of an aggregated API server to work with Cube 130.
I don't think the update we're talking about suggests that. In fact, the conformance says that lets 117 libraries work with 130.
Again, be directed.
I do not want to have an admin saying I cannot have a 130 version of an aggregated API server run against my 129 cluster. I think that's a conversation that would be.
You can't. Validating admission policy will break unless you take exceptional action. Yeah. Let's I know we're out of time. Let's maybe go to the PR where this is being proposed. Yeah, and talking about a change to a library, I also think the compatibility version stuff, some of the implications of that were maintaining the ability to talk to multiple versions of an API. So I think we may already be heading in a direction where our libraries will need to do that. But I can't remember how far we got down that road.
All right, thank you. We are out of time.
Yeah, we are at time. Thank you everybody for the discussion. I will upload this later in the day. Maybe I will post the recording into the PR too as context. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. Have a great rest of your day, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thank you.